Well, good morning, Velocity. It is so good to be here with you guys this morning. My name's Austin, if you don't know me, and we are in week two of our series, Love Across the Lines, engaging with people who are different than you. When I think of this idea of engaging with people who are different than you, I'm transported back to 16-year-old me who had just gotten his license, got his first car, and thought he was pretty much the coolest person in the world. And having just got this first car, I was like, I want to get a custom bumper sticker to put on the back. I'm going to design it myself. I'm going to come up with something clever. I'm going to put it on the back of my car. I'm going to be so cool. And so after much thought and thinking I'm just this little pseudo-philosopher, I came up with this bumper sticker. I was so proud of it. And I simply put, why can't we all just get along, on the back of my car? And I thought I was clever. And looking back on it, it was pretty dumb and pretty naive of me to get that bumper sticker, but I was proud of it and I thought I was so clever. But I will say, looking back, I do still wonder why it is that we can't all just get along. Because I imagine I could ask each and every one of you in this room, if you could snap your fingers today and create a world where everyone got along, where there was no hatred, no violence, no injustice, no bitterness, no outsiders, no outcasts, no one feeling alone, you would create that world. We all desire that world. If we could move to that world tomorrow, we all would. And the thing that's interesting to me is the more I've thought about this, the more I realize that it's not even that we don't know the solution. That it would not take a great deal of effort to answer that question, why can't we all just get along? How do we create that world? It's not that we don't know the solution, but it's that we struggle to implement it. Because the solution, in a word, to all of us getting along, to creating that world where no one feels left out, where no one has to go through their days lonely, where no one experiences hatred, where no one experiences bullying, where no one experiences that feeling of being an outsider, where there is no division, where we're not divided between us, but we are united together. To create that world wouldn't be that hard. What we need, in a word, would be empathy. And if you're not familiar with the concept of empathy, empathy is simply the ability to share one's feelings, to be able to relate to someone, to engage with someone. If you want to engage with someone, you need to be able to step in their shoes, like your parents have probably told you, like you've heard a million times. And it's not a hard idea to come up with, but we all struggle to do it. You see, last week we spent a lot of time kind of up in the clouds, as I'd like to refer to it. We were talking about the why that it's so important that we engage with people who are different than us. And we talked about why we have to love across the lines, why we have to get rid of the walls that divide us, why we have to stop dividing the world into us versus them, but realize that it's only us. But this week, I want to get really practical and talk about what does it look like to love well. How do we love across the lines? How do we grow in empathy? How do we create that world where we all could just get along? And I think the most beautiful picture of what it looks like to live that kind of life, what it looks like to live the kind of life that creates the world that we all want, is found in the book of Colossians, which was a book, really a letter written by a guy named the Apostle Paul in the first century. And Paul was an interesting figure. At the beginning of the Christian movement, as the movement was beginning to gain steam, Paul was going about systematically persecuting Christians, putting them to death, doing his best to end the movement before it ever got started. Until one day he's on the road to Damascus, on his way to go persecute and kill Christians, when he encounters the risen Jesus, and his life is transformed, and he becomes one of the most influential figures, not just in Christian history, but in the history of the world, as he began spreading the movement of Jesus all throughout the Roman Empire, planting churches all over, one of them in a city called Colossae. And he wrote a letter to the people in Colossians, just helping them and encouraging them on how to live the life that they were called to. It's in that letter that we have this picture that I was referring to. In Colossians 3, verses 12 to 14, it says this: Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these virtues put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. You see, the center of everything that we talk about in here, the center of what it takes to create the world that we want, the center of this entire message, no matter what we're talking about, has always and will always be this idea of love. I think perhaps the most world-changing idea that was ever put to paper was when the Apostle John wrote in the book of 1 John the concept that God is, in his very essence, love. That love is the center of it all, that we were created from a being who can be defined as love. And I believe that it's all of that for all of us to grow into who we are meant to be, the most true version of ourselves, us reaching our full potential, looks like the most loving version of you. And if love had like a major leagues, if there was a major leagues of learning to love well, it would be learning to love people who are different than you, people who are difficult, people who you would consider a them. As we talked last week, we often divide our world into the us's, the people who look like us and think like us and believe like us, and the thems. And Jesus pointed out that it's very easy to love the people who agree with you. It's very easy to love the people who love you back. But if there was ever a major leagues of developing as a human, if there was ever a major leagues of learning to love well, it would be loving across the lines, engaging with people who are different than you. And I believe that to engage with people who are different than you, it takes about 3 steps. And we're going to run through those real quick this morning. We're going to get right to it because I think this is a concept that could change so much for you. And you see, last week I talked to you about my journey of learning to love across the lines. And I want to make it clear, I am not the best at this. I have so much to grow in this. But I know that the more that you step out into this, the more that you desire to love people who are different than you, the more that you begin engaging with people who you might disagree with, the more you begin to grow, the more that you become the you that you were always meant to be. And it's a journey that has been amazing for my life, and it's a journey that I want to invite you onto. And so the first step to loving well is to get into proximity. And last week we talked about how my journey with engaging with people who are different than me started with meeting with people of different religions, and whether it was staying in a Buddhist temple for a couple of nights, or going out and having a meal at a mosque with different leaders of the Muslim community here in Frederick, or going out to eat with a rabbi or a Greek Orthodox priest. The first step in all of these things was to get into proximity. And as we talked about last week, the reason that we have to get in proximity to people is that at a distance, we dehumanize. At a distance from other people, we dehumanize them, but proximity, it personalizes. And you see this happen all the time. You will notice that people will say things online at a distance that they would never say to you face to face. People say things behind a screen that they would never say in person, or people say things about people they've never met, people who are distanced from them, who they've dehumanized, that they would never say if they were sitting across the table from them. And last week, I challenged that perhaps the greatest person of all time at getting in proximity to people who were different than him was Jesus. Because there has never been 2 people more different than Jesus and us, the perfect Son of God and his creation. There have never been 2 people more different. And we talked last week about how Jesus was often found at parties with people who were incredibly different, who the entire world would have given up on and pushed to the fringes and said, these are the thems, these are the outsiders. This week I want to look at a little different story about how Jesus was able to love across the lines and engage with people who were different than him, to get in proximity with the people who perhaps needed it most. And it comes in the book of Mark, chapter 1. And Mark is one of our 4 Gospels in the Bible. It was written by a guy named Mark. And it was the first Gospel that we have. And his account, though he wasn't an eyewitness of Jesus, came from one of Jesus' inner disciples named Peter. And in Mark 1, verse 40, it says this: "A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Jesus was filled with compassion. He reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said. 'Be clean.' Immediately, the leprosy left him, and he was clean." I love this idea that Jesus saw this man and he was filled with compassion. Because what it tells me is that Jesus sees us in our brokenness, in our pain, and the things that have happened to us, and he says, that should have never happened. You never should have had to go through this, and I feel your pain. I am with you here. Your hurts hurt me. I feel your pain. I wish you never had to go through that. And he is filled with compassion. He sees our hurt. He sees our brokenness. And he's not distant from us, but he says, I am here with you. And I desire that this would have never happened to you. But the thing that I think is so important that happens in this passage is something even different than that. You see, to understand the full weight of this passage, you have to understand what it would have meant to be a leper back in the first century. A leper, as you probably know, is someone who had leprosy. And leprosy was a skin disease, and it was a nasty, nasty disease that would eat away at your skin, and it was highly, highly contagious. So maybe before you had leprosy, you might have had a wife and kids, you might have had friends, you might have gone out and hung out with people all the time. But after you contracted the disease, you would have been forced to live outside the city walls, physically placing walls between you and other people and starving you of human connection. Because each and every one of us, we were created to engage with other people. We were created to live our life in proximity to others. We were created to connect. And that is why being starved of the thing that we desire so much, of human connection, is one of the worst possible punishments humans can endure. That's why we have come up with the worst punishment for the worst criminals to be: solitary confinement. Because being confined in that way, to be cut off from everyone else, it literally eats away at our souls. We so desperately long for that connection. And what Jesus gave this man was not just healing, but he gave him what he needed so desperately. What he would have desired more than anything was to be seen, to be known. You see, Jesus, he healed many different people in different ways. He could have, from afar, just said, yeah, you're good, you're healed. Could have snapped his fingers and it'd be done. But Jesus went up to this man, reached out his hand, and touched him. This man wouldn't have been touched by another human being for years and years and years because he would have been considered unclean. There's something so powerful about human touch. It's why the handshake is not just a symbolic gesture, but there's actually a biological response. When you connect with another human being, when you get in proximity in this manner with someone else, it biologically changes you and it connects you to them in a profound way. When I think of this idea of proximity, it reminds me of just a couple months ago when my girlfriend and I were going up to her cabin in West Virginia, and we were driving through Berkeley Springs. And Berkeley Springs is this tiny little town in West Virginia, and in this tiny little town, there's a tiny little movie theater with just one theater, and we drive by, and over the top of the theater it says, "Tonight's showing 5 feet apart." And she looks at it and goes, "Oh, they're showing 5 feet apart." And I was like, "Do you want to go?" And she's like, No, it's okay. Like, I know you don't want to go see that. And I, pretending to be a very great boyfriend, said, "Oh, you know what? We'll do this for you." Truth is, I'm just not above a good chick flick. Like, some of them are just kind of good. So, I'm not above that. I'll watch that. And so, soon enough, we were in said theater watching 5 Feet Apart. And if you're not familiar with the storyline, it's about two star-crossed lovers, as it always is. But in this case, it was two people with cystic fibrosis who, because of their illness, could not get within 6 feet of each other. But they decide they're going to be rebels, and they get within 5 feet, but they're destined to live out their days 5 feet apart from each other. And in that movie, this story has gripped the hearts of so many people, and the book became wildly popular and has moved so many people because it shows us and it taps into this truth that we all know, that to connect with another person, to get into proximity, is so powerful. And as we walked out of the theater, and she was crying and I was holding it together, I thought about this. And I thought just how powerful it is to be able to get near people. That when we get close to people, we connect in a very different way. That getting in proximity is the first step to be able to truly empathize with someone, to truly connect with them, to truly love. You see, when I began embarking on this journey of connecting with people who were different than me, I could have just talked to them over the phone, I could have emailed them, I could have texted them, but I knew that if I was ever going to truly engage with them, I had to get into proximity. And my question for you would be, who are the people in your life that you should be connecting with, that you should be reaching out to, but you're not willing to get into proximity with? Who are the people that you're not willing to cross the cafeteria to go sit near? Who are the people that you're not willing to go shake hands with? Who are the people you're not willing to get near to for fear of what other people might think, or just because they're way too different than you? If you're going to accept this challenge of learning to love well, to become the you that you were always meant to be, to love across the lines, the first step is to get into proximity. But it doesn't end with just getting into proximity. The second step in learning to love well, if you take this journey into the major leagues of engaging with people who are different than you, will be something that is oh so important. It's a skill that I think is highly undervalued in our society. It's something that we don't even think of as a skill, something we don't think of to get better at, but it's something that I see us getting increasingly worse at, and something that concerns me because this act, this ability, is central to being able to connect with anyone and to be able to love well, to engage well, to create the world that we all want. And this skill is simply this. It's the ability to truly listen. You see, because I think all of us know that you can be in proximity with someone, you can take that first step. Maybe you do this every night at the dinner table, you get into proximity with people, but you are not emotionally engaged with them. You are not in your head space, you are not there. Your body might be there, but mentally you are anywhere else. And listening to me is so important because listening in and of itself is an act of love. Because I like to create simple definitions for things because I'm just not that smart of a person. I like to break things down to things that even I can understand. And to me, the most basic definition of love is simply you first, not me. You first, not me. I desire to live a life that says you first, not me. Love is putting the good of others before yourself, often at expense to yourself. And listening is an act of saying you first, not me, that I'm going to give you my attention when I would rather be running my mind in a million different directions. You see, I think one of the greatest gifts that we can give people is our full attention in a world where there are a million things vying for our attention, trying to distract us, trying to place us in any other moment besides the one that we're actually in. Because you can be sitting across the table from someone, but mentally you can be in the land of the vlogger that you're watching on your phone. You can be in the land of your friends who are on vacation while you're scrolling through your Instagram. You can be in any other world, but the greatest gift you can give someone is your full, undivided attention, to be in the room with them, right across from them. If you're to love well, it requires giving someone your full attention. There's a verse in the book of James that I think really well illustrates what it looks like to love well, to engage with people who are different than you, and what it means to listen. And it says this: "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." And I think the way he's paired all these things together is so important, because the more you begin engaging with people who are different than you, the more you're going to begin coming across people with whom you disagree. If you're truly loving across the lines, you're going to be in spaces where people just drive you crazy and they have these opinions and thoughts that are completely contradictory to yours. And your first reaction is to be quick to speak, slow to listen, and quick to become angry. You see, because so often when we engage with people who are different than us, before they're even done talking, we're thinking of our response, we're proving them wrong before they've even finished their sentence. We're getting upset at what they said before we've even heard their full thought. But I want to give you this idea for listening well that I think can completely change the way that you listen and completely change the way that you interact with people who are different than you. Then when it comes to engaging with people who are different than us, when it comes to truly listening, we need to adopt a mindset of curiosity over criticism. Curiosity over criticism. Because the first thing you're going to want to do when you engage with someone who's different than you is be critical of what they're saying, because what they're saying makes no sense and they're wrong, and you need to remind them of that because that's just your God-given job, apparently. But if we are to love well, if we are to listen well, we need to adopt curiosity over criticism. What if every time you encountered someone who you just, I do not understand, you realized and when you say, I don't understand how this person could think this, I don't understand this person at all, I don't understand how they could believe this, I don't understand. Well, if you don't understand, you have an opportunity to learn something. I'm not saying they're right, but you have something to learn about them, about people, about how people work. And understanding how other people work, how they think, it allows us to truly engage with people in a deeper and better way. I remember a few years ago, my friend and I, we were doing a cross-country road trip, and we found ourselves in Austin, Texas, and we were staying with his long-lost Uncle Bobby, who was kind of this estranged uncle who he had never met, that the family didn't really stay in contact with, but we needed a free place to stay, and so that sounded good enough. And when it comes to people who are different than you, Uncle Bobby was about as different from Felix and I as it gets. Felix and I are both people that are more comfortable in like a downtown coffee shop than in a rural farm. Like, for instance, I know that a lot of you Velocity people have like chickens and ducks and goats and pigs, and like you like that. That sounds horrible. to me, but I'll love you across those lines anyway. We can be friends. But I remember when we got to Austin, Texas, Uncle Bobby's idea of a fun time was he took us down to Cabela's and wanted to show us all the mounted dead animals that were hanging up. And Felix looked over at me multiple times and said, "Shoot me now." And there were plenty of guns in Cabela's, so I guess that would have been a possibility, but I refrained. And so I remember as we were walking out of Cabela's, Felix leaned over to me and he said, "How do you engage with this guy? How have you been talking to this guy as if he is a sane human being for the past hour?" Because not only was he different than us, but he was saying things that were so politically incorrect, that bordered on racist, and were certainly just not in good standing, not things that normal people say. He says, "I know you disagree with everything this man is saying. How do you still engage with him?" I remember looking at Felix and simply saying, "Because I'm just curious. I don't understand him at all." But criticizing him isn't going to get me anywhere. What if I adopted curiosity over criticism? What if I said, "Because I don't understand you, I have something to learn. I want to learn how this makes sense to you, because I believe that everything other people believe makes sense to them, even if it's wrong. So if they're saying something that I don't understand, I have something to learn about them." I'm never going to be able to empathize with them. I'm never going to be able to share their feelings. I'm never going to be able to see the world from their point of view if I don't adopt this mindset of curiosity. But after we've gotten into proximity, and after we've listened, we have another final step to take, and perhaps the most important one and the most powerful one, and the one that carries the most weight. I know that when I went into these meetings with people of other faiths, when I began getting outside my comfort zone so far, this was the step that intimidated me the most, because I knew it was the chance where I could mess everything up. I could royally screw it up through this. And that is after we've gotten into proximity and after we've listened, and listened more than we think we probably should when we've adopted curiosity over criticism. There does come a time for us to speak. And James says, "Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry," but that doesn't mean that we never speak. But our words, we have to recognize, are oh so powerful. And there's this truth that is both amazing and terrifying about being a Christian. You see, as Christians, when we get outside of our comfort zone, we engage with people who are different than us, we are going to represent Christ to them. I remember when I went into these meetings, these people were representing their faith to me, and I was representing not just myself, not just my beliefs, but in their mind, because I identified as a Christian, the words I said, my actions, they all reflected on Christianity, the church, and Jesus himself. And that is terrifying to me. And even more so than what we do, our words are the most powerful resource we have available to us, because our words are the things that stick with people for oh so long. Chances are you can remember something mean that someone said to you when you were just a little kid that you've never been able to get out of your mind. And hopefully, on the flip side, you can remember a word of encouragement, a word of pride that your parents spoke to you, something where they said that they loved you. When someone's words spoke love into your life, you can remember that for years and years. You see, a lot of us today, we're familiar with this idea of being a brand ambassador. As you scroll through your Instagram, you'll see brand ambassadors for all different types of things. And people, when they are a brand ambassador, they are paid to represent a brand, and everything they do will reflect on that brand. And perhaps my favorite communicator in the world, and a pastor I look up to so much, puts it this way, that as Christians, the brand is in your hand. The brand is in your hand. We carry the burden and the responsibility and the privilege of representing Jesus. The brand is in our hand. And if you identify as a Christian, wherever you walk and whatever you say will reflect not just on you, but on Christ, the church, and Jesus. And our most powerful resource for influencing the way that people see us, for influencing the way that people see Christ and the church and Jesus, is our words. And the Apostle Paul, just a little bit after he wrote those words that we looked at earlier, in the next chapter he wrote this. And I think it's oh so important, and it speaks directly to what we're talking about today. In Colossians 4, 5, and 6, he says this: "Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders," which is exactly what we've been talking about all throughout this series. Be wise in the way that you engage with people who are different than you. And I think it's no coincidence that the very next thing he begins to talk about is our words. He says, make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. You see, I think for many of us, when we talk about these ideas of evangelism, which gets this really bad rep and has this bad connotation to it, but evangelism is simply nothing more than talking about Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I see Jesus as this beautiful figure, so I'm always happy to talk about Jesus. But when we think about evangelism, talking to people about our faith, I think our biggest concern is, what if I don't have the right answer? What if I don't know what to say? What if they ask me a question that I don't know the answer to? And I love what Paul says here. He says, don't be prepared to always give the right answer, but that if your conversation is full of grace, you will know how to answer everyone. That more than being right, more than knowing the exact right doctrine or answer to this or that, the best answer is the one that is full of grace and seasoned with salt, so that we may know how to answer everyone. And that idea of seasoned with salt, it's not something that we would usually say. I would never think of saying, season your words with salt, besides that might make them taste better. But to the ancient world, salt would have had a different idea to it. Salt would have been used as a preservative back before they would have had refrigerators. And so what if you looked at all of your words as an opportunity to be a preservative to others? What if you ran your words through the filter of, will this preserve their sense of value? Will this preserve their sense of worth? Will this preserve the idea in them that I think that they matter, that they are loved, that they are seen, that they are known, that they are cared for? How could your words act as a preservative? What would your words look like if they were seasoned with salt? And lastly, I'll never pass up an opportunity to talk about grace. Because grace is the central point of the message of Jesus. Grace is the scandal of the gospel. Grace is the idea that while we were still sinners, while we had turned our back on God, while we were running from God, God chased after us. He never gave up on us. And despite our past, despite our failures, despite our constant rejection of Him, He came to us right where we were, did not ask us to get our act together first, but died on a cross while we spat and cursed Him. He said, Father, forgive them, that no matter what we do, He never, ever, ever gives up on us. I will never pass up an opportunity to talk about grace, because grace is the great message of the gospel. Grace is the great scandal of the universe, that God, who owed us nothing, decided to chase us down even as we pushed Him away. Decided to love across the lines, decided to enter into our world, to reach out His hand to us as we tried to knock Him away. And He said, I will never, ever, ever give up on you. I will never stop chasing you down. And grace is what propels us to love across the lines. Grace is what allows us to become the versions of us that we were always meant to be. Because grace shows us that if God can have grace for us, if we can stand under the waterfall of God's grace, how could we hold that grace to ourselves? How could we be stingy with grace after all the grace in the universe has been poured out to us? How, having received the grace of God, can we not extend that grace to other people? And I want to challenge you this. As hard as that may be, as counterintuitive as it may be, as much as you might say, but they don't deserve it. What I think Jesus is calling us to is to have grace in every case. Grace in every case. I don't care what they've done. I don't care the labels you put on them. I don't care how different they are than you. Grace in every case. Because how could we not extend that grace, having stood under the waterfall of God's grace for us, having seen the lines in the sand that we drew between us and them, between the insiders and the outsiders, that was washed away in a flood of God's grace, saying, I am here for you. How could we not extend that grace to others? Grace is what propels us to do this. Outside of that, this is just an exercise in being a little nicer, a little kinder. And you'll often run out of steam if you try to do this on your own power, but what if you recognize the grace God has had for you? That He's seen you at your worst moments. He's seen all the promises you've gone back on. He's seen the things you've done that you aren't proud of. He's seen the things that you wish no one ever knew about. Seen the wrongs you have done and will do. And God, who is utterly perfect, God who owes nothing to you. God who could have just distanced himself from you and said, you know what, these humans, they wrecked this world that I gave them. Why don't I just go start again? Entered into that world, hung on a cross, let nails go through his wrists and his feet. And as we cursed him, still never, ever gave up on us. Having experienced that grace, how do we not extend grace to others? If he could love across every line there ever was, if he could cross heaven and earth to get to us, how could we not walk across the room to engage with that person we usually wouldn't? How can we not walk across the cafeteria, walk across the sports field, walk across whatever arena you may find yourself in, walk across the neighborhood to the person who looks different than you, thinks different than you, believes different than you, is just difficult, we're different. How can we not reach out our hand to them, having reached out and grabbed the nail-scarred hand of our Heavenly Father who crossed heaven and earth to get to us? See, as we close, I want to look one more time at that verse that we started with. The verse that I said is the most compelling picture I've seen of what it means to be the us that we were always meant to be the version of us that is our most true self, and reach our full potential, the most loving version of ourselves. When it says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I wonder what our world would look like if we did that. Bear with one another and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And above all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. As beautiful as that verse is, I want to go right before it, because it starts with therefore. And something I've learned in reading scriptures, anytime you see a therefore, you want to ask, what is the there for? What is he referring back to? What is he saying therefore because of? And in the verse directly prior to it, it says this: here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. And I can't imagine how scandalous this would have sounded to people who got their entire sense of value, their entire sense of their own self from their ethnic identity, and Paul washes all that away. He says, you see all those lines we draw between us, the us's and the them's, the insiders, the outside, this label, this label, this label. He says, Christ has washed it all away in a flood of grace. That line in the sand has been washed away. We are all one. We all share the same Heavenly Father, and that makes us brother and sister. He says, Christ is all and is in all. I think perhaps the greatest contemporary picture we have of loving across the lines comes from someone who you're all probably familiar with. A lady named Mother Teresa, who spent her entire life dedicated to serving the urban poor of Calcutta, India, worked in the slums with people who everyone else had given up on. Everyone else said didn't matter. Everyone else said was less than human. People who would go years without showering, whose teeth would have been falling out, whose hair would have been caked in mud and dirt, who would have been disease-ridden and as poor as it comes. And one day she was asked, how do you do it? How is it that you love across those lines? How do you devote your life to this? And she said, it's simple, really. I just imagine each one of them is Jesus, but Christ is all and is in all. And the truth is, inside of each and every one of us is the image of God. Each and every one of us is a dearly loved child of God. So she was spot on when she said, I just imagine each one of them is Jesus, and Jesus taught us that whatever we do for the least of these, meaning whatever you do for the people you would usually overlook, whatever you do for the people who you've casted out to the outside, whatever you do for the people that have the lines in the sand between you, whatever you do for the people who need love most, you do directly for me. What would your world look like if you saw people not as the labels we put on them, not as the distance between you, not as their worst moment, not as their beliefs, not as the activities, not as their past failures, their present shortcomings, but what if you saw each and every person not as someone not deserving of your love, not as someone too far gone, not as someone too difficult or different for you, but as Jesus himself, as someone that Jesus crossed heaven and earth to get to and reached out his nail-scarred hand and said, I will never give up on that person. What would your world look like if you saw every person as Jesus himself? Because my guess is is that if we all adopted that view of the world, there would be no need for any more pseudo-philosophic 16-year-olds to put a bumper sticker on their car that says, why can't we all just get along because we all just